EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping?
Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN, the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Perhaps you were an active Catholic in high school, let's say, or even college, and then stepped away from the faith for whatever reason. Now you're starting to re-examine your life and decisions that you've made and what the church stands for, and you're saying, well, golly, maybe I need to do a makeover there or a do-over. But there's this one thing that I need to get settled in my mind. Let's talk about that. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. You could also tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. Perhaps it is a decision you came to decades ago, and now you're starting to rethink that. Again, 833-288-EWTN. Lines are starting to fill up right now. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply for some folks anyway. And also you can send us an email any time of the day or night, ctc@ewtn.com. The address, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook Live, we're streaming there right now. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, Tom. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
This is the monsoon season, I think, for at least us here in Birmingham.
It sure feels like it. I like you said the other day, I need an ark to get to work these days.
But you know what? Great nap weather.
Yeah, there's that.
You may want to think about that. Mm-hmm. We're going to answer a question as we received it yesterday from Lisa. Lisa was watching us yesterday on Facebook. We could not get to her question because we just ran out of time. So here it is. Lisa, we hope that you're listening. She says, my daughter was married in the Catholic Church. After 5 years and 3 kids later, her husband found another woman and filed for divorce. My daughter wanted to go to counseling and stay together, but he didn't. He went on to marry that woman. Now my daughter herself has met a guy. They might get married. He's perfect for her and the kids, but I was told she could try to get an annulment, but might not be approved. She didn't want the divorce in the first place, so why does she have to pay for what her ex did? And if she gets married in a different church, is she now committing adultery? Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate the question. So this is a tragic circumstance, and your daughter was victimized, to be sure, and exploited and badly treated, and she is innocent in that and is not the perpetrator, and shame on her ex-husband for treating her that way. That's just awful.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. She did nothing to deserve this, and he made a vow of lifelong fidelity, and he broke that vow, and that's on him. Now, in terms of the Catholic teaching on marriage, following the teaching of Jesus, is that it is in principle a lifelong, indissoluble union for the sake of raising a family. That's what marriage is. And there is no authority on earth that can dissolve a valid marriage. And the obligations that one incurs to one's spouse do not go away just because the spouse is a real so-and-so, So, if my wife cooked me a bad dinner or, burnt the toast, it would not absolve me of my obligation to treat her a certain way and be faithful. Now, that's a trivial example, but it goes even up to and including if somebody's spouse commits adultery or leaves, it still doesn't dissolve a valid marriage. Now, it might necessitate living apart. It might necessitate seeking a civil divorce and certain protections in the law, maybe from an aggressor or an abuser or something like that. But nothing, neither trivial nor profound, can separate what God has joined. That's Jesus' teaching, so that's the teaching of the Catholic Church. And if a person is, say, has been reduced to living alone when they had an expectation of a partnership and married life, you're right. That's not their fault. That's something that is presently and continually being imposed on them by the one who abandoned them, right? But it doesn't necessarily give them the right to go marry somebody else, right? So what does the church do in a situation like this? Well, what the church does is say, well, we need to determine if there was a valid marriage there to begin with. And it's not necessarily a valid marriage just because the people said it was, right? Because there are certain conditions that have to be met in order for there to be a valid marriage. And one of those conditions is that the people who enter into the marriage have to intend what the Catholic Church means by marriage. And very often in these situations, the spouse who leaves, the spouse who is doing the abandoning, did not in fact intend a lifelong indissoluble union. And if they didn't intend that, then they didn't vow to do it, not sincerely, and therefore it's not really a marriage, and the church can grant a declaration of nullity, an annulment, find that there was no valid marriage, and then your daughter would be free to marry. And I predict that's probably the outcome, and I would strongly recommend that she talk to her priest about pursuing an annulment so that she can go validly married in the Catholic Church.
All right, very good. And thank you again for your question, Lisa. A quick one here from John, an email. I am a non-Catholic. I'm arguing with a friend about grace. My argument is that if I fail at something, that means God doesn't want me to do it. What do you think?
Your argument is that if you fail, then that failure was fated, and God is responsible and not you.
Right.
Well,
right.
that's not the Catholic position at all, right? That God is not the direct cause of evil, and failure to perform some duty or obligation under the law is a sin. God does not cause sin. The cause of sin is in our will, not in God. And if we're believers who've been baptized and are in the church, then we have sufficient grace to do good. God does not command the impossible. It's one of the dogmas of the church. Actually, Council of Trent made that a dogmatic belief. All Catholics are bound to believe that we have sufficient grace to obey all of the commandments, period, end of paragraph.
John, thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we're going to be talking with Rebecca in Omaha, also Jenny in Dubuque, Iowa, Chris in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. 3 lines open for you at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
This is Bernadette Boguski, Executive Director of WCCR Cleveland, AM 1260 The Rock. Why do we need Catholic radio? To reach the hearts, minds, and souls of those who are searching for deeper meaning and don't know where to turn. To bring clarity to a world full of lies and confusion. And to share the good news of joy and mercy with a world so desperate for the truth.
The world needs EWTN Catholic Radio. Now more than ever.
Life matters. Democrats on Capitol Hill seek to make it easier for women to get an abortion. And public health concerns. The Vatican looks at inequalities across the globe.
Clear, concise, Catholic. EWTN News Nightly with Tracy Sable. Monday night, 9 Eastern on EWTN Television and Radio.
Smart speakers help with a lot these days. Did you know you can use your smart speaker to hear the top stories of the day from a Catholic perspective?
On Google Home, all you have to do is walk up to your speaker and say, "Hey Google, play Catholic News."
Here's the latest news.
Welcome to your daily Catholic news briefing.
For more information on how to get the latest Catholic news on your smart speaker or wherever you get your podcasts, go to CatholicNewsAgency.com/smart speakers.
Call to Communion in progress on this soggy Wednesday afternoon with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. 2 lines open right now, 833-288-3986. Here is something delightful for you if you're planning ahead, looking toward the holy season of Advent. What about this? You may have never heard of such a thing, a magnetic Advent calendar. For a fun way to count down to Christmas, you just move the magnetic star from number 1 to number 25 each new day of Advent in anticipation of the birth of Jesus. The colorful nativity scene has a sturdy easel back. It can be easily displayed anywhere you want. And a prayer card is included. It offers suggestions of things to pray for each and every day. What a great thing for your family. The Magnetic Advent Calendar, it's available right now at EWTNRC.com. Buy Catholic, shop Catholic, EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We're going to begin today with Rebecca in Omaha, listening on YouTube. Hey, Rebecca, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I'm hoping that you can help me with a discussion I've been having with some non-Catholic friends of mine who are Christian, and we were talking about people who are raised atheists and how are they held accountable for that if from the time they were born, they were raised by parents who taught them this is right. What these people over here believe is wrong. This is right. There is no God. And if they live their life, doing good with their time and talents, maybe they volunteer, maybe they donate, they're overall great guy or gal, is that going to be held against them when it's time to go to heaven?
Thank you. Yeah, I understand the question. Yes, thank you so much. So we are not saved in virtue of affirming the proposition God exists. The book of James is very clear that Satan and the devils affirm that God exists. They're not real happy about it, but they affirm it. It does not save them. And we are not saved simply in virtue of affirming the proposition God exists. We're rather saved by being united to God in charity and virtue. That's how we're saved. We're saved by God by being united to Him in charity and virtue. Insofar as God is charity itself, God is love. That's what St. John tells us. And when we participate in that love and imitate that love and are penetrated by that love, it's thereby we are saved. And that comes about as a result of God's grace. Now, the teaching of the Catholic Church is that God makes grace available, sufficient grace for salvation, to every soul, without exception, from Adam to the last man, who turns off the lights. I mean, everybody who has ever lived will have the offer of grace made to them. While the most manifest, complete, full, and accessible expression of that grace is in the Catholic Church and the incarnation of God's only Son, Jesus, there are more inchoate, implicit presentations of grace made to everyone. And it is not for us to judge the extent to which someone lays hold of that grace and participates in that grace in a way that may be salvific, though known only to God. That's not for us to judge, but for God to judge. As to, does God hold people accountable for invincible ignorance when they, through no fault of their own, have been deprived of the knowledge of the gospel because of their culture or upbringing or circumstances? Does God hold them responsible precisely for that ignorance as culpable? The answer to the question is no. And Pope Pius IX actually spoke about this specifically with respect to Protestants, but I think the logic would apply to atheists as well. And he said, if somebody's brought up in a Protestant sect and they've been taught from childhood that the Pope is the Antichrist and the Catholic Church the whore of Babylon and they should despise and reject all things Catholic, and they're conditioned to that, they're not in a way to be responsive or receptive to the preaching of the gospel for reasons that are not their fault. And they can also be saved through grace, charity, and the virtues if they collaborate with, they cooperate with them. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that many people who are atheists because they reject the existence of a God that Catholics also reject. And if you read the literature of some of the so-called new atheists, the Dawkins and Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris and these kinds of guys, it's quite evident if you've read any of their books that, I mean, I'm sitting there reading their books thinking, you hate that. Well, I hate that too. I don't believe that either. You know, like the caricature that you're rejecting of religious faith, I also reject. That's not my Catholic faith that you're rejecting there. I'm rejecting it along with you, you know.
Okay.
And they have in mind oftentimes a very anthropomorphic conception of the deity, a kind of ancient Near Eastern despot who sits on a throne and hurls lightning bolts at people, you know, acts tyrannically and so forth, and makes arbitrary demands and absurd moral demands on people, and then punishes them eternally for not following those prescriptions. That kind of conception of the divinity is not the Catholic understanding of God at all. Now, it's an important part of Catholic intellectual tradition, reflecting on the history of religious thought throughout the centuries, that many of the early fathers, especially men like Justin Martyr in particular, believed that the ancient Greek philosophers were saved in virtue of their participation, their rational participation in the divine logos. Logos, of course, is the word that St. John uses for pre-incarnate Christ, you know, the principle of rationality by which God made the world. That by their participation in that word of God, that rational principle, that they were sort of Christians before Christ. That's the language that they use, because they had a kind of participation in this divine logos. Now, if you go back and read those early philosophers, especially Plato knows nothing of the God of the Hebrews at all. He knows nothing about the Pentateuch. He knows nothing about Moses. He only knows the ancient Greek polytheistic religion, which he seems to reject, more or less, or at least he allegorizes it away. And he has a kind of a non-theistic theology, if you will, a kind of concept of a ultimate transcendent good in virtue of which everything has to be evaluated, and that's sort of the principle of all things, and with which we should seek to be united and assimilated and participate, but doesn't really have the attributes of a divinity per se. And when the fathers of the Catholic Church look back on that kind of theology, they recognize that there's something there approaching the Catholic doctrine of God, even though he didn't use the name, and the concept of God, Plato didn't apply to that, because for him, God meant, you know, Zeus and Hera and all these characters, right? And yet it didn't stop the fathers of the church from looking at that and saying, yeah, he too participated in the divine logos. Now, in the modern era, when I read modern atheists, I find they fall into different kinds of camps. There is the kind of cocksure, arrogant, fundamentalist atheist who's just dead set on attacking all religious people and destroying objective morality and running around and, you know, being obnoxious. He's an atheist with a chip on his shoulder. And then there is the kind of atheist of goodwill who again may have a kind of antipathy towards traditional religion based on a kind of fundamentalist stereotype, but he's nevertheless seeking to kind of penetrate to the depth of things and live an ethical, purposeful life, and may even approach something like the Catholic concept of divinity. And I'm thinking here of somebody like Thomas Nagel, who is like my favorite atheist. I mean, you know, a lot of times when people want arguments for the existence of God, I tell them to go read the atheist Thomas Nagel, and they'll come away believing in God, even though Nagel doesn't want you to draw that conclusion, you know. And there's a very different spirit that runs through that kind of a text. So I don't think you can lump all atheists together.
Rebecca, we really appreciate your phone call. Thank you so much for it. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. One line open at 833-288-3986. All right, let's go to Ireland right now, and David is listening to us right there. Hello, David. What's on your mind today?
Hi, guys. Lovely to hear you. I really enjoy your program. Watch it every Saturday.
Thank you.
4 o'clock over here.
Thank you.
Yes. Doctor, is it part of Catholic faith that the Catholic Church will always be, or is it a kind of hubris on Catholic thought? I mean, I see people leave the church, and I hear that even 50% of converts leave the church after a year. Is it part of Catholic understanding of itself that it always will be? That would be my first question. And my second would be relating to J.R.R. Tolkien's saying that the long defeat is it part of the Catholic's understanding of itself that it will always be defeated in its aims?
Yes, thank you.
Hello?
I appreciate the question. Thank you so much. So first of all, it was the teaching of Jesus that the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. That's what Christ said.
Yes.
But I think we have to take that with a certain degree of nuance, because Christ never said, for example, that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, say, in the Levant in the 10th century A.D., or that the gates of hell might not prevail against the church in, say, Egypt in the 9th or 10th century, or Baghdad, and I picked these countries in particular because there was a period in time when the numerical heartland of Christianity was the Middle East, from Egypt into Persia, and it was, hadn't even penetrated into Northern Europe, and the largest, most populous Christian diocese in the whole world was Baghdad. And then this little thing happened called Islamic expansionism, and the heartland of Christianity was absolutely decimated by the rise of Islam, and historic churches that had been around for a millennium were all but wiped out. And so I think that, history has shown that the church in a particular region, in a particular domain, might in fact be utterly extirpated. And something very similar happened in 16th century Japan. You had this massive flowering of Catholicism in early modern Japan, and it really looked like, Japan might go the way of Christianity. And then the shoguns took a look around and decided they didn't like that, and they killed everybody. And that's a pretty quick way of getting rid of the church. You just kill them all, right?
Yeah.
And of course, to this day, Japan is not an overly Christian country at all. It's a very, very small Christian population, and it was stopped in its track by aggressive persecution in the 16th century. So I don't see any reason to be, overly sanguine in any particular domain. So I know you're calling from Ireland, and my understanding is it's pretty grim over there in terms of, compare 100 years ago. In terms of mass attendance and so forth, and it's really fallen off a cliff. And so, can I predict the course of the church in Ireland? Absolutely not. And I think the Irish Catholics, have to see what they're going to do about that, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully not go the way of Japan in the 16th century. But while one nation seems to be losing the faith, then there are other parts of the world where it's exploding. And who would have thought 100 years ago that, we used to sort of derisively and dismissively talk about darkest Africa. That was the kind of colonial language that Europeans used about the African continent, kind of dismissive and prejudicial. Well, guess where the faith is exploding now like no place else on the planet? I've got African priests in my own parish, and I'm like, send more. We need more of these guys. They're fantastic.
They're great.
The English were so keen to colonize and evangelize India. If it weren't for the Indian priests, we wouldn't be able to keep our churches open over here. So one place goes down, another place goes up. So the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. It will endure till Christ comes back. But that doesn't mean we should be complacent about the church in our own neighborhoods.
Yeah. Any thoughts about Tolkien's quote there about the long defeat?
I thought I prided myself on being a Tolkienista. But to be honest with you, I'm not familiar with the phrase, and I'm going to have to go research it. Now you've really given me an assignment. So I don't want to comment on that passage because I'm not familiar with it.
Do you know where he talks about that, David?
Oh, it's the Elf Lord guy representing the angels and that, as far as I understand it.
So this is from the Silmarillion?
Pardon?
Is this from the Silmarillion?
No, it's from the Two Towers.
Oh, well, now I'm really embarrassed.
Well, you ought to be.
Now I'm really embarrassed.
As far as I remember.
All right. Well, I'll have to go back and look at that again.
Okay, very good. David, thank you so much for checking in from Ireland. Don't be a stranger. Love to talk with you again sometime. It's called A Communion here on EWTN with Dr. David Anders. Let's go now to Jenny in Dubuque, Iowa, listening on her Alexa device. Jenny, what's on your mind today?
Well, hi, Dr. Anders and Tom. First of all, thank you. I appreciate you and all that are involved in making Called to Communion possible. It's very well received.
Thank you.
So you're welcome. My question is, will you please explain the how and why wisdom is referred to as she? I suspect it might have something to do with Mary eventually, but could you just explain that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So both in Hebrew, and I'm not a Hebraist, Father Mitch is, he comes on later today, but my understanding both in Hebrew as well as in Greek, the word wisdom is feminine, and it's obviously, at the very least, it's a kind of literary technique to personify wisdom, and this is especially true in Second Temple Judaism and the literature that comes out of that era of Judaism. And there was a tendency overall in Second Temple pseudepigraphical and deuterocanonical Jewish texts to depict God's court as occupied by, semi-divine intermediaries, if you will. And that's an idea that Philo of Alexandria picks up and runs with and introduces the idea of kind of logos theology as well. Wisdom is one of those characters in that depiction that becomes personified. Seems sensible to me, since the word is feminine in both of those languages, that it takes on a feminine persona.
Jenny, thanks for your call. In a moment, Chris in Cedar Rapids, Michael in Spokane, Washington. A line open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN for Call to Communion. Anders,
how has Catholic Radio changed your life? Share your story by calling 205-795-5773. That's 205-795-5773. Tell us how Catholic Radio helps you.
There is tremendous power in prayer, because when we acknowledge that we don't have the power, but God does, things then begin to move for our good. Remember Matthew 19:26. But Jesus looked at them and said to them, "With men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Now that's power.
And now, the EWTN Family Prayer with Father Joseph.
Family, a prayer that we pray together is a powerful prayer. So please pray together with me our EWTN Family Prayer. Today we pray for young people. Heavenly Father, we worship you, our Creator. You have brought each one of us into existence because of your loving generosity. Protect young people from the many snares of temptation that surround them. Shield them from drugs, fornication, self-indulgence, and sin. Lead them in the path of life and of true love. Surround them with angels to guard, defend, and guide them. Let none of them be lost, but grant that they may fulfill your plans and find lasting happiness. Amen.
How do you honor Our Lady of the Rosary?
Let's share how we do that tomorrow on Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
On most of these EWTN stations.
Now we return to Call to Communion.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Hey, let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Our phone number is 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. We have a few phone lines open right now, so if you call now, we're probably going to get you on. Here is Chris now, as promised. Chris in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, listening on Sirius XM 130. Hey there, Chris. What's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you. I appreciate your time. Question, why is there a split in the church, meaning Eastern Orthodox versus non? And why are they allowed to have their own pope? And then if I were to go to their mass, it would count as my obligation.
Okay. Yeah, I can answer all those questions. Yeah, thank you. So few misconceptions there. The Eastern Orthodox do not have a pope per se. Now, there are specific Eastern Orthodox congregations who use the name Pope as the title for their patriarch. So the Coptic Church in Egypt, for example, will refer to their patriarch as Pope, but they don't mean by that word the same thing that Catholics mean when they use the word of the Holy Father. They're not claiming that the Coptic Patriarch has universal jurisdiction over the whole world, which is, in fact, the Catholic claim about the Bishop of Rome. But they do use that word. But he doesn't claim to be Pope over all the Orthodox, just over the Egyptian Coptic Church, right?
Okay.
Now, the other misconception is if you as a Roman Catholic, if you are Roman Catholic, I presume you are, you're not allowed to satisfy your Sunday obligation by attending an Orthodox church. That does not count. You can, however, go to a Catholic church of the Eastern Rites, and there are 22 Eastern Rite churches in the Catholic Church, many of which celebrate the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is the predominant liturgy used in most of the Orthodox churches, like the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, that sort of thing. And so from, in terms of your experience of the liturgy, it would be very, very, very similar. And in fact, it does sometimes happen that people that are not terribly well familiar with the differences might wander into, either an Orthodox or an Eastern Rite Catholic church and not know the difference, unless somebody pointed it out to them. And I have been in Eastern Rite Catholic churches where the priest makes a point of mentioning, and by the way, guys, we are Catholic. See that catechism on sale in the bookstore? That's the catechism of the Catholic Church, which we actually believe, has to remind people this is, in fact, a Catholic church, even if we have the what would seem to be the Orthodox liturgy. Okay. But the main distinction between the so-called Orthodox and the Catholic Church boils down to the way we regard the authority of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope of Rome. And the major difference is that the Catholic churches, whether they be Latin, Greek, Ukrainian, or otherwise, the Catholic churches regard the Pope as the vicar of Christ who possesses universal jurisdiction over all the churches of the entire world. And Christ said, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." So very, very strong language that Jesus uses with regard to St. Peter and, by implication, his successors, the bishops of Rome. And that's the Catholic position. Orthodox recognize the Bishop of Rome as having a kind of primacy of honor, sort of primacy among equals, and a very, very significant historic position in the Church. And some will even go so far as to recognize that in antiquity the Pope exercised a kind of authority by way of being the court of last appeal, but they want to maintain that the individual Eastern primates and patriarchs and so forth maintain an independent jurisdiction that can't be overridden by the Pope, right? So that's the way they would view it. Now, where did this split come from? Why does it exist? So when Christ founded the church and sent the apostles out into the four corners of the earth to make disciples, they, of course, did that. They went to the four corners of the earth, made disciples, and the church took root in different cultures of antiquity. They went to Egypt, and you had the foundation of the Coptic church, eventually Ethiopia and Eritrean church. It's Syria and Antioch. They went farther east to Persia and to India. Of course, they went to Asia Minor and Cappadocia. They went to Rome. They went to southern France. And in all of these different, Armenia also, in all these different regions, the church grew up with indigenous rites, indigenous languages, to be used in sacred worship. The embellishments around the Holy Supper that Christ gave us, we know and understand as the Mass or the liturgy, those embellishments also evolved differently in different cultures, and that's where the different liturgical rites come from, R-I-T-E-S, rites. And those traditions have endured for 2,000 years and give a great flavor and variety to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and demonstrating the principle of enculturation, that the gospel has been received and celebrated in complementary ways in different cultures. But in antiquity, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Facebook. The Pope did not have a Twitter page in the first century. And so inevitably, some of the more far-flung areas of the church might go, decades without communication from, over the sea. And so naturally, patriarchs and bishops exercised a de facto jurisdiction that was highly independent of Rome, right? Okay. Now, they may not de jure, in terms of the foundation of the church by Christ, the Pope had that jurisdiction, but doesn't mean that he was actively exercising it by, calling the patriarch of over in Baghdad every week and saying, what's up, buddy? It didn't work that way. And so as the cultures developed independently from one another, and those rites and theological traditions developed independently, Constantinople in the East became incredibly powerful politically and theologically because it became the seat of Constantine's empire. And so by the time you got to the late 4th century, there were many Christians in Constantinople that said, hey, we're the top dog because we're Constantinople. And we've got the emperor, and we've got all the scholars, and we have all the money, and we've got all these great monks. We have all these great traditions. We've got a great idea. Why don't we displace Rome? And we'll make Constantinople the head of the church instead of Rome, because after all, we're the seat of the empire. And they floated that idea at the Council of Constantinople. And it went, nope. And the rest of the church said, no, thank you. No, thank you.
Went over like a Led Zeppelin.
Went over like a Led Zeppelin, exactly. Not going to go there, because Rome doesn't have the primacy in virtue of its political significance, but because of the imminence of its two greatest apostles, Peter and St. Paul,
Sure.
and the promise that Christ made to Peter. This is in virtue of Petrine succession, not in virtue of its political importance. And so that idea sank without a trace. But it was articulated. And there were Byzantine theologians at the time that said, no, the Pope is the head of the whole church. And so we've got documentary evidence to that fact in Byzantium. Well, as the centuries began to unfold, and, the political center of Rome fell, and Europe entered into the Dark Ages. You had the barbarian invasions and loss of literacy, and there was a cultural collapse in the West that was quite profound. The Western world wouldn't regain the level of economic development and culture that it had in the late Roman Empire until the 17th century. But Byzantium did not fall. And so from the Byzantine point of view, we Latins were just a bunch of rednecks, uncouth barbarian rednecks. And then the barbarian rednecks won the day. They carried the election, and Charlemagne shows up as the Holy Roman Emperor. He's scratching under his armpits, and he can't read. He couldn't read. He was illiterate. And he has himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And the Byzantine Emperor did not like that one bit at all. And they said, no, we're not going to have this. We're not going to have these yahoos from Alabama running the show. And so the political situation got more tense. And then there was a fellow by the name of Photius. He was a patriarch of Constantinople, and he gets deposed and he loses his office. So he appeals to the Pope to be reinstated. The Pope says, no, I don't think so. And Photius says, oh yeah, well, maybe you're not the head of the church after all. See, what provoked this was, in fact, a political concern. Now, Photius ends up being reconciled to the Pope before he dies, but the seed was sown. Right? The cultural differences were there, the political differences were there, and the seed was sown. You don't like the decision that comes out of Rome, maybe we should just dispute Rome's primacy. And it really came to a head during the Crusades, and the Fourth Crusade in particular, when Latin Crusaders sacked the see of Constantinople for the reasons that armies are wont to do such things, gold, guns, and girls, and but then had the audacity to try to impose Latin Rite Catholicism on the Orthodox, well, I should say the Byzantine Catholics. And that was sort of the last straw, and they said, we've had it with you, you Latins. We're done with you, and we're going to be done with you and your Pope. So the evolution of the split is cultural and political and centuries long, but it's heartening to know that even in the midst of all that, there have always been Byzantine Christians and Eastern Rite Christians that have maintained their fidelity to the Pope of Rome as the universal pastor of the church. In particular, the Maronite tradition, it's a Syriac church from the Middle East, has never been out of communion with the Pope of Rome. In fact, there were Maronite patriarchs, Maronite representatives at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, signaling their adherence to the universal jurisdiction of the Pope of Rome. And a lot of steps have been made in the last century in particular towards recovering that unity. And I think if we haven't got a juridical unity that's been regained, at least there's a good deal more goodwill on both sides. And Christ's desire is that the church would be one, so we pray for the healing of that rupture.
Yes, indeed. And Chris, great question. Thanks so much for your call. It is called A Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN Radio. Tom Price here reminding you to join us for Blessed to Play Sunday afternoon, 4:30 p.m. Eastern. This week, Ron Meyer interviews Kevin Wells. He is a former Major League Baseball sports writer with the Tampa Bay Rays. He is also the author of Priest and Beggar. Ron talks with Kevin about his career as a beat writer for a Major League Baseball team and why he wrote a book on the life of Venerable Aloysius Schwartz. Should be a great program Sunday afternoon, 4:30 p.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. Blessed to play with Ron Meyer. Always a great show. Let's go now to Michael in Spokane, Washington, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Michael, what's on your mind today?
Well, thank you both. It's hard to follow a caller from Ireland, but
I know.
Yeah, we do have great park systems here in Spokane, Washington, and Bing Crosby grew up here, which surprises many people, and Gonzaga basketball. Well, my question is dealing with the Masons. It is my understanding that the Masons are very anti-Catholic, and what is the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and the Masons?
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So we have to distinguish the history of the Masonic Lodge, of course, from the attitude of individual Masons. And there are plenty of people who belong to Masonic lodges out there who don't know that they're supposed to hate Catholics and may be very nice folks. And we don't hold anything against them as people, in virtue of an association that they may not be totally cognizant of themselves,
Of
right?
course.
They join because, they like, I don't know, they like pizza and bowling or something, and they like to have friends and participate in civic activities and so forth, and they're not in it for hating Catholics. But historically, the Masonic Lodge really came to cultural prominence during the age of the Enlightenment, the 18th century, when there was a great deal of animus against the Catholic Church's influence on civil society. And the same sort of spirit that animated the French Revolution that led quite literally to blood in the streets and priests being drowned and beheaded and executed in terrible ways and thrown in prison and the church being utterly proscribed, that spirit of anti-clerical violence very much was woven into the heart and history of Freemasonry. And it was a secret society of sorts, pledged in part to extirpating Catholic influence in civil society. And so there's a long history of antipathy between the church and the Masonic Lodge. And it's conspicuous if you even wander around the United States and you look at older lodges that have been around for 100 years or so. They are often built deliberately in close proximity to the Catholic cathedrals.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember my one and only trip to St. Louis, driving, down near Jesuit Hall and St. Louis University, big Jesuit university, and having my Jesuit chauffeur point out to me the Masonic Lodge that was strategically located as close to campus as it could possibly be, and that was not an accident,
Right.
In what used to be the Archdiocese of Birmingham, down in Mobile. I mean, the Archdiocese in C. We used to be Mobile. Now we're our own diocese, but in Mobile, Alabama, beautiful cathedral down there, and not a block away, there you find the Masonic Lodge, and this kind of typical, right? And they hold doctrines that are antithetical to Catholic belief. So one of the principal doctrines of Freemasonry is the doctrine of religious indifferentism, that it does not matter what you believe, provided you believe in some God. And deism is common among Masons. And, well, the Catholic Church says it does matter what God you believe in. It's not a matter of indifference. So that's flat contrary to cardinal Catholic belief. So for that reason, Catholics are not permitted to join the Masonic Lodge. They're not allowed to under canon law. But again, pointing out that just because the lodge has a history of antipathy and antagonism towards the church doesn't mean that every individual Mason shares that, and we don't want to be prejudicial towards people.
Right.
But we would like to point out to them the history of their organization and suggest that maybe they want to leave if they want to become Catholic.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for your call. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Got a call from Maureen in New England, and she said to tell you, David, that Galadriel said that line about the long defeat in the chapter in Lothlorien in the Fellowship of the Ring.
Thank you. And during the break, I took the liberty of looking it up and reading the passage, in one of these Tolkien fandom sites. And
okay.
Now I've got egg on my face, and I really like C.S. Lewis. I guess I'll just plead that,
Okay. Good enough. That sounds good to me. Lenore is in New York, and Lenore is listening on Sirius XM. Lenore, what's on your mind today?
Yes, I have a daughter who's getting married soon, and two things that have come up. One is I'm under the impression that priests are not allowed to say Mass outdoors. She claims that the bishop where she wants to get married says that it is okay to say the Mass outdoors. I was wondering if that's allowed. And also, if two Catholics decide to not get married in the Catholic Church, can they then baptize their children?
Okay, thanks. I appreciate the question. First of all, there is no absolute prohibition on saying Mass outside. You know, John Paul II, when he was Karol Wojtyla and working as a chaplain in the university in Poland, used to take kids on camping trips, and he'd say Mass on an upturned canoe. You know, I've seen photographs of him doing it. And so you can have Mass outside. Now, when it comes to the Catholic wedding, it is far more appropriate to have the Mass in the church, far more appropriate. And the reason why, I'm not saying you can't, of course the bishop can grant a dispensation. Yes, that's possible. Why should you prefer the church if possible? Well, the marriage for Catholics is a sacrament. You are being inducted into an order in the church. In the same way that a priest is inducted into the order of clerics when he is ordained.
It's a big deal.
Now, can you imagine a priest saying, can we have my ordination at the country club? You know, Uncle Bob wants to come and, you know, they have great margaritas over there. You know, can we do the ordination? It would be grossly inappropriate. Right? Because of the close union of the sacrament of orders with the altar and the Eucharist and the bishop and the people of God. And so how appropriate to celebrate that ordination in the cathedral. Well, for the exact same reason, the ecclesial order of marriage, the marriage estate, is no less a part of the church's essential constitution as is the holy priesthood. It's a different order in the church, but it's still part of the church's essential constitution, and it's irreducibly, ineluctably connected to the altar, to the sacraments, to the confessional, to the priesthood, to the bishop, and to the people of God. And a person who is marrying as a Catholic needs to understand that. That's one of the reasons that we have instruction, we have preparation prior to marriage, so folks understand what it means to be married as a Catholic. That you have a function in the church to bear children, to raise them up in the fear and admonition of God and the faith of the church and the sacraments, so you can be a witness to society of Christ's love for the church. Bring the world to God through the sacrament of your marriage. And for that, we need the grace of the sacraments. So it's eminently appropriate that Catholics should marry in the church. You might like sunsets in the beach, but it's a whole different animal, completely different thing. Now, but if the bishop wants to grant a dispensation from canonical form, he can do that. Of course, he can do that. Now,
okay. All right.
I would really be tragic if for somebody this was a kind of make or break issue. You know, we'd like to be married at the country club. The bishop won't let us, so we're going to get married out of the church. I mean, that's a terrible tragedy. What a sad conclusion.
Yeah.
If they do that, they're not married. They're not married. That's the first thing you have to understand. If they go have a civil wedding in front of a justice of the peace or some Protestant minister, if they're Catholics, that is not a valid wedding. They are not married. Period. End of the state might consider them married. The church does not. It's not a valid marriage. Unless the bishop grants the dispensation, it's not a valid wedding, not a valid marriage. So can't do that. Please do not do that. Now, can an unmarried couple, which is what we're talking about, bring their children for baptism? Well, the answer to that question is yes, provided the church has a good reason to believe that the children will be raised in the Catholic faith. Because the church doesn't want to deny people baptism.
Sure.
So it's not the child's fault that the parents are not married. The child still needs baptism, and if there's a kind of a moral certainty that the kids are going to be raised in the Catholic faith, yes, they can be baptized, but wow, much better that their parents be married.
Sure. Lenore, thank you so much for your call. Here is Lou now in St. Louis listening on the great Covenant Radio. Lou, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thanks for the call. I have a question about, there's a statement that Bertrand Russell makes in his lecture called Why I'm Not a Christian, and the statement is, you know, of course, that the Catholic Church has laid it down as a dogma that the existence of God can be proved by the unaided reason. Well, doesn't the Church teach some things about God, for instance, the Trinity, that are really not accessible by the unaided human reason?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the question. So, first of all, the Church does not say that everything that we know about God can be derived from reason alone. It doesn't say that, all right? It says that God's existence can be demonstrated from reason, but certainly not his triune nature, which we know only by divine revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that God's existence can be known does not mean that we can know his essence. St. Thomas Aquinas is alleged to have said to his Benedictine teachers when he was about 6 years old, not who, but what is God? What is God? He asked. And by the time he finished the Summa Theologica, some 49 years later, well, actually 43 years later, his conclusion was that he still didn't know the answer to that question. He knew that God existed, but not what God was, not in his essence, not in his essence. So, yes, there are things we can prove about God by reason alone, namely that God exists. And we can prove a lot of things that God is not. God is not a burrito. He clearly is not a burrito.
Clearly.
There are lots of things that God is not. And we can prove those. We can prove that all of these finite aspects, all these finite creatures of our experience are not God. And that's saying something. You think that's nothing. That's actually a lot. And I honestly think that a good deal of Catholic spirituality consists in learning all of the things that are not God. And we keep learning new things that are not God, not to be attached to. But that God exists, we can prove, and that he is not many other things, we can prove. But of his essence, we do not know. There are things about God we know from the Catholic faith, not by reason but revelation, like his triune nature, his creation of the world and time, his the procession of the second person, the incarnation of the Son of God. These are things we know from Revelation.
Lou, thanks so much for your call. Let's go now to Ken in Seattle, listening on Sacred Heart Radio. Ken, just a couple of minutes left here. What's on your mind today?
Yes, I just want to know if I'm interpreting Scripture correctly. I read Romans 2, verse 12 through 16, and the way I understand it, it says that the Jews who have the law doesn't mean they're saved by the law, and the Gentiles who do not have the law are not saved either. But it looks to me on the bottom line there, God will judge us what was in our heart and how we treated people and how we were, and it doesn't matter what religion we were in, that's how we're going to be judged in the end. We'll just have people from out of town.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the question. So Romans 2:14 says, when Gentiles who do not have the law, and he's speaking here of the law of Moses, when they do not have the law, but rather do by nature things required by the law, then they are a law for themselves even though they don't have the law. And they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences bearing witness. Now, there's two ways to interpret this verse. One of them slides on down to chapter 2, verse 25 to 29, where Paul says, those who have the law written on their hearts are those who have it written there by the Holy Spirit. So he's talking here, one way of reading this is he's speaking about Gentiles rather than Jews who have that inward law given to us by grace. And so this would be Gentile Christians. There's another way of reading it, that the internal law he's talking about is the natural law that we can know by reason. And I think both of these are possible and they can even cohere with one another. But the answer to the question is, can someone get to heaven without explicit knowledge of the God of Israel? And the answer to that question is yes.
Okay, very good. And Ken, thank you so much for your call. We could not get to a very interesting question here from Sylvester in Albania. So we're going to carry that over to tomorrow. We'll also get to Ada Lou and Matthew, all those folks listening today on YouTube, and also one from Jorge listening on Facebook. I apologize. We just flat ran out of time. Hey, Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tom.
Don't forget, we do this program Monday through Friday here on EWTN Radio, 2 p.m. Eastern, live for you pretty much every weekday, and with an encore at 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific. Always check out the podcast 24/7 at EWTNradio.net. On behalf of our great team, I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders. See you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. God bless.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
Part of the success we've had on the world over, I attribute to certainly my relation